Hello, everybody. I'm Sonal with the Intentional Endowments Network. Welcome you all to this webinar. We're really excited to have you here. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. All currently on mute. We encourage you all to send questions via the chat function as they come up. We're going to do a moderated Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, ask somebody speaking, put it in there, and we'll address them, and as many of them as we can get to at the end of the presentation. So today we're going to be talking about KnowTheChain's benchmarking findings and looking at how companies are addressing forced labor and human trafficking risks in their supply chains. As we've all seen over the past few years, not only can supply chain practices lead to gross human rights violations, they also pose serious business risks to companies and their investors. Last year, KnowTheChain created a benchmark that looked at 60 companies' efforts to address these risks. They focused during this benchmark on sectors that are high risk of forced labor, including the IT sector, communication, food and beverage, and apparel and footwear. Next slide, please. So we're lucky to have a couple of distinguished speakers today. First, we're going to have Felicita Weber kick off. She's the lead for the KnowTheChain project. She is leading the development of the forced labor benchmark. She's also spent a number of years working with investors on human rights engagement. She led PRI's investor company engagements on human rights for many years. Next slide, please. Before I hand it over to Felicita, just a little bit about the Intentional Endowments Network, for those of you who don't know us. IN is a nonprofit peer learning network that supports endowments in better aligning their investment portfolios with institutional missions, values, and sustainability goals without sacrificing returns. We do this in a variety of ways through events like this webinar. We host a number of forums. We gather and develop resources for this constituency. And we also work a lot to connect peers and experts to help accelerate this process for different endowments. So Felicitas, I'll hand it over to you now. Nicole, the next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Sonal, and really excited to be with you all today. So my name is Felicitas Weber. I'm a project lead on KnowTheChain, and I'm with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which, in case you don't know, it is an NGO that researches human rights policies and practices of over 6,000 companies globally. KnowTheChain is one of the projects we're involved with together with other partners, including Humanity United, Verite, and Sustainalytics. And we're also involved in other projects like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, for example. So if we go to the next slide. I wanted to speak to you today really about two things. So first of all, to share the findings of our benchmarks that we did last year on the 60 companies that Sonal mentioned, but then also to provide you some tools and resources and how you can engage companies on the topic. So before we jump into the benchmark results, I just wanted to give you a brief background on the methodology and a company selection process. So you'll see here we looked, as Sonal mentioned, at company sectors, and we selected 20 companies in each sector looking at market cap, but then also for the technology sector, for example, looking at the degree to which the companies derive revenues from physical products, given the risks are higher there. And for food and apparel companies, we looked at the degree to which companies derive revenues from own branded food or apparel products. You'll see here on that map as well, so we did look at global companies, but there's over half of the companies were from North America and also quite a large chunk of companies from Europe and Asia that we covered in our research. And in terms of the information we reviewed, so we focused very much on public disclosure and looked to start with on companies' websites, including annual reports, CSR reports, but also invited companies to provide us additional information based on a series of engagement questions. So if we go to the next slide. So you'll see here themes that we evaluated companies' disclosure against. Each of the themes was equally weighted, so companies could receive a total score of up to 100 against those 7 themes, which are, to start with, commitment and governance, which includes aspects like top-level commitment, supply chain standard, but also management, accountability, training, and stakeholder engagement. We looked at traceability and risk assessment and to what extent companies disclose the findings of their risk assessments. We looked at purchasing practices, which includes elements like, for example, supplier selection, whether companies integrate their forced labor standards into contracts, and also whether companies cascade standards down the supply chain. Recruitment was another area that we looked at, and looking here really at how or if companies reduce exploitation through recruitment agencies and eliminate workers' payment of fees for their jobs. Then worker voice was another area that we think is really crucial. Here we looked at how companies communicate with workers throughout their supply chain, so looking at aspects including freedom of association and grievance mechanism. Monitoring was another area that looked at auditing of suppliers and also whether companies disclose the outcomes of those audits. And remedy focuses on both whether companies have corrective action plans for suppliers in place in cases of non-compliance, but also whether companies have a process in place to provide remedy to supply chain workers. Now, if we go to the next slide. So you'll see here the average score for each of the 3 sectors. As I mentioned, the total score was 100, so you'll see that there's definitely significant room for improvement across the 3 sectors. Although definitely it also stands out that the footwear and apparel sector is the more advanced sector, and we've also found stronger leading practices across the themes in this sector. And we also had, in each sector, I think both positive and negative, so among the lowest scoring companies, it was quite striking that even though we looked at some of the largest global companies in each of the sectors, we did have a company that scored 0 out of 100, but at the same time, most of the lower scoring companies had at least a commitment in place to address forced labor, but sort of lacking steps taken to then actually implement that. So if we go to the next slide. Now, I think it's a very full slide, I admit, but I think it's a little bit more interesting if we look at, what does this average score mean if we look at the different themes of the benchmark. So you'll see here for each of the 7 themes, you'll see for each of the sector the average score for the theme. Now, as I mentioned before, again, there's this theme that the food and beverage sector, which is sort of the 3rd circle under each of the themes, tends to be much higher than the other 2 sectors. Interestingly, the only exception is traceability and risk assessment, where the technology companies had higher score. So we did find across the sectors that companies tend to take steps to trace their supply chains. And in particular, across sectors, that was often done for commodities where there was a multi-stakeholder initiative in place. And I think in the case of the ICT sector here is also that the Dodd-Frank Act and the disclosure regulations here were certainly a driver for companies having to trace their supply chains. Now, 2 of the areas where companies were relatively speaking stronger are commitment and governance and also monitoring. So commitment and governance, I think in general companies, the majority of companies had demonstrated an awareness of and commitment to addressing forced labor, have supply chain standards in place, and a number of companies also have training programs or engage with stakeholders. A particularly good example here was Adidas, who has supplier training that really goes down the supply chain. So they have in place a modern day slavery outreach program, and the company does train their tier 1 suppliers and also has very specific training on risks related to migrant workers, passport retention or recruitment fees, but also they work together with their tier 1 supplier to train tier 2 suppliers, which I think is a really interesting model and is currently also working on developing collaborative models to address risk in the third tier, so really looking down the supply chain. In the area of monitoring, so as I mentioned, also relatively speaking a stronger theme, where we've seen a number of good practices such as robust audit systems, or companies disclose those processes. But again, we've also seen good examples, albeit it wasn't that many, but some good examples of companies that also did monitor their lower tier suppliers. So in general, we feel that companies need to address and understand risks also in their lower tiers, particularly forced labor often occurs in lower tiers. And there is also an opportunity, as in the example before, that companies can work jointly with their suppliers to do that. So for example, again, Adidas asked its suppliers to share its own standards with their suppliers and audit their suppliers. We also had other examples of Microsoft, to take an example from the technology sector, which does audit its tier 1 suppliers, but then looks at, within its tier 2, looks at the highest risk suppliers and audits the high and medium risk suppliers in its tier 2 as well. And likewise in the apparel sector, a number of companies where we've seen good examples of monitoring lower tiers, for example, VF includes subcontractors in its monitoring, like cutting facilities, embroiderers, laundries. So really assessing those risks in those lower tiers where forced labor often happens. Now, even in those two areas, as you'll see here, so I think the highest average scores were 64 and 66. There is still room for improvement, but I think the really big data gaps we've seen on 4 of the other themes, so purchasing practices, work voice, remedy, and recruitment. So you'll see here the circles are much lighter, indicating that a lot fewer companies reported any information. At the same time, I think we still have seen a number of good examples across those areas. So when it comes to purchasing practices, for example, we've had a number of companies that reported that they put in place longer-term contracts with their suppliers, which might be multi-year contracts or even partnerships over decades, in which case it then also makes more sense for the company to invest in training and capacity building of those suppliers. We also had a number of companies report that they have regular discussions of production plans with suppliers, provide longer lead time to suppliers, or smooth out production between peak and low season, again helping suppliers to avoid subcontracting and better planning, which allows them in turn to implement better labor practices. Particularly positive was also here H&M as an example, who supports its suppliers in implementing a living wage for their workers and reflecting any wage increases also in its pricing. Recruitment was another area where disclosure was quite limited, but we had some good examples. A number of companies that have put in place at least a policy to requiring suppliers to pay recruitment fees and not putting that burden on migrant workers. And Ralph Lauren was an example here that also provided evidence of having such a policy in place, raising awareness of the topic, but then also providing evidence that if it identifies cases where fees are found, so it had identified a case where 30 plus Bangladeshi workers working in Jordan had to pay high recruitment fees, and so the company ensured that those workers were reimbursed. Worker voice is another really key area, and here one of the good examples was coming from the apparel company Primark. which is working in a partnership with an NGO in India, worker education groups. So it does that actually in the communities where the workers live. And that program focuses on educating workers on their rights, but also on using negotiation tactics with their managers. So they then did an evaluation of that program and found that workers were better able to vocalize their rights, but also to use those tactics actually with their managers in the workplace. And that resulted in concrete improvements like wage and bonus increases, paid time off, access to benefits, etc. Now, remedy is another area which it doesn't actually seem that low here, and we have had a number of companies that have corrective action plans in place, so to address any issues occurring with their suppliers, but information on how remedy would be provided to supply chain worker was very much limited. But again, at the same time, we have seen some very good examples of companies that provided a clear process of how they would respond to complaints, and also provided examples of outcomes for workers. So for example, Hannes Brands disclosed that it works with stakeholders to help remedy any issues discovered at supplier's facility, and provided examples of when it worked with suppliers that had fired employees for exercising their right of freedom of association and ensured that those employees were reinstated. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to show you here quickly for the footwear and apparel benchmark what one of those rankings looks like. So you'll find the same rankings on our website for the other two sectors. And you'll see here there is quite a few companies scoring, around the average of 46, but overall what's been quite interesting across the three sectors that there is really quite a wide variety of score, which means there's really a wide variety of how companies address those issues and also disclose on their approach. Now, if we go to the next slide, one thing I also wanted to mention is that the benchmark results really very much mirrored the sort of levels of engagements that we've had with those sectors. So we, as I mentioned before, we invited companies in each sector to provide additional disclosure. And with the apparel companies, we at least managed to interact with each of the companies, and the vast majority of companies provided additional information, whereas this number was much, much lower for the other two sectors, although still encouraging. So I thought that was quite interesting as well. And I also did want to mention that we also engage with a number of industry associations and cross-sectoral initiatives with the aim to reach beyond those 60 companies. So we've been in conversations with really across with a number of initiatives, and maybe just to mention two. So the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition has been very helpful in facilitating dialogue with their member companies. Forced labor is very much high on their agenda. They've also updated the code of conduct for their members to include several provisions. And likewise with the Consumer Goods Forum, we had very good conversations with their members, and they also recently put out principles on forced labor. So I think this is also a very interesting opportunity to engage the sectors more broadly. So now I also wanted to show you how you can actually use the resources that we have put out. So for that, I would like to just show you the KnowTheChain website. So you'll see here, so if you go to knowthechain.org and then go to benchmarks, you'll find the information of each of the three benchmarks, and you can each each of them you can look for, if you're interested in finding by themes, by companies, by methodology. You can also just click on either of them and just browse through, have a look through. Here is the company ranking that I just showed you, some of the key findings, and there's also, for each of the sectors, we also have a findings report, which also includes some broader information on risks in each of the sectors and findings in those sectors that might be helpful if you have a specific sector interest. Now, if you're interested in a specific company, you can just click on, whichever company you're interested in, and you'll then get to a page where you'll see just a view where there's more color company is doing more, where there's less color company is doing fewer things. If you're interested in a very detailed breakdown how the company is doing on each indicator, you can see that here as well. But what you can also do is we have this PDF download for each of the companies. So you'll see here a little bit of an overview how the company is doing, areas where the company is doing well, and opportunities for improve. Also the scores for each sector, and then in a little bit of detail, some areas where the company is leading compared to its peers, other areas where the company has good practices in place that can be found across the industries, and then some specific opportunities for improvement for that particular company, which can be really used as an engagement tool as well for investors. And there is also a link to the additional disclosure of the companies that have provided that. And likewise, some of you might be interested in engaging companies on a particular theme. So you might want to have a look at, say, recruitment as a theme, and you can see here a summary of how the sector is doing. You can also see how companies score on this particular indicator only, and again have some additional information on leading practices, recommended actions for a particular theme. Now, another section I wanted to share with you is the resource section of our website. So we have here a number of resources for companies and investors. And for investors in particular, we have here this investor resources tool, which really looks at sort of a number of questions you might have when you think about engaging with companies on forced labor risks, like why should I actually engage on this? What's sort of the materiality of this? How do I identify risks? What questions should I ask? How can I integrate forced labor in a broader dialogue I might have with a company, for example, on human rights or supply chain management or the SDGs, etc. So say, assuming you might want to evaluate what one of your companies might be doing to address labor risks and how exposed they are. So we have here a number of resources that can help you identify which sectors are at risk. There's obviously some sectors that the ILO has identified, and the sectors that we as KnowTheChain have identified are very much high-risk sectors, but there is also more granular data available, for example, from these two resources. The US Department of Labor has a very good list, and Verite, for example, has this responsible sourcing tool where you can really look by commodity. You'll see here all the companies where, the countries where there are known forced labor risks. It also looks at child labor and countries which have both. So I think that's a very interesting tool if you want to know more about risks of certain goods and commodities. If your company is covered by the KnowTheChain benchmark, obviously that's a great tool to use for engagement. If you're not sure if any of your investee companies are covered by us, there is a spreadsheet that you can download here, which has an overview of all the companies. So it also has the ISINs and tickers. You can see if the company participates in relevant industry associations. You can also look at how they do on particular themes against their peers, which might be useful to point out in engagement dialogues. And obviously, if you find that there is a company here which has a low score, and you have a holding, as I mentioned, the company scorecards that I pointed out before have company-specific recommendations where the companies might be able to improve. Now, if your company is not covered by our benchmark, you could, but you are looking at one of the 3 sectors that KnowTheChain is looking at, you can use the findings report and look at the sectoral recommendations we have put out. And even if the company isn't in one of those 3 sectors, you can still use the KnowTheChain methodology to really just ask companies questions to identify whether they understand and address forced labor risks in their supply chain. So you'll see here some questions that you might want to ask. So, for example, if you are talking to a company that is, that is maybe not very advanced with regards to their sustainability, performance, or reporting, or also not that advanced just with labor rights more broadly, you might want to start with just finding out whether the company has a supply chain standard or commitment to address forced labor, which might sound pretty obvious, but it was actually quite surprising that a number of companies don't have that in place. And again, likewise, to really start addressing those risks, you actually need to understand them. So asking company to what extent they trace their supply chain, where they source from, to which tier or to which commodities they have traced down to commodity level. Do they understand their risks? Which forced labor risks have they identified? Could be starting questions. If you're talking to a company that is sort of a little bit more advanced and has those, has a supply chain standard in place, has identified its risks, you might want to focus on some of the other themes from our benchmark. And for example, ask the company, well, if it has these expectations, how are they translated into purchasing practices, and how does the company mitigate risks related to recruitment practices and exploitation of migrant workers? Another question could be, how does the company ensure that supply chain workers are empowered to exercise their rights and ensure that their voices are heard? There is, additional suggestion in this document. So if you are interested in how to engage companies on that topic, that might be an interesting resource. If you have any suggestions on what else you would like to see, we'd really like to hear from you as well. Just one last, I think I'm very much over time, I'm just realizing. I just wanted to point out one last resource, if that's okay.
Yes, definitely solicit us. Please do. And we have some questions coming from the audience that I'll share with you when you're done.
Perfect. So just as a very last thing, I just wanted to mention as well that the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre has also a tree of statements under the UK Modern Slavery Act. It has over 1,300 statements of global companies. You can search by name, you can search by company headquarter and sector, and you'll see here there's over 80 statements of companies as well. So that could also be an interesting engagement tool, and we will also be adding here to what extent companies fulfill their legal requirements in a few weeks. So with that, maybe we want to have a look at the questions, if that sounds good, Sonal.
That sounds great, Felicitas. We've got a very engaged audience here, and we've had a number of great questions come in. A couple of people have asked Felicitas how you chose the companies that were covered in the benchmark, and how you chose the 20 companies for each industry, and what the selection process was.
Yep, thanks. So we first of all started with market cap because that we felt the biggest companies tend to have the biggest supply chain and workers. And we then looked for each sector, also looked at the degree to which, for example, in the ICT sector, in the technology sector, we looked at companies that had at least a certain percentage of revenue coming from physical products, because there's very much high risks in the minerals with which those products are made, like gold or the sort of 3T minerals, whereas in software there's these risks are much lower.
Great. And one more question before we move on to Bennett. We had one audience member ask, they said they were curious why some of the highest scoring brands were in athletic wear, and they were wondering if there was a specific movement within that subsector of apparel.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that. Would you mind repeating?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry about that. An audience member asked, they were curious why several of the high-scoring brands were specifically in athletic wear, not just in apparel, but in athletic wear. So they were wondering if there was a specific reason or movement why athletic wear has taken this issue on more seriously than maybe the rest of the apparel industry. Could you hear me okay?
Sorry, was that, sorry, I'm really having troubles at the moment. Is that why the athletic wear companies are performing better than some other apparel companies? Is that right?
Yes, if there was a reason why, if there was a driver specifically for the athletic wear companies, that there was a movement per se. Great.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it has been quite interesting. So Adidas, which was the highest scoring company, definitely had very, very strong practices in place. Whereas we were actually quite surprised that, for example, some of the luxury brands companies were scoring relatively low, whereas you could expect that, you know, they ask consumer for higher prices, so would have more money through their supply chain and maybe more money to invest in CSR stuff, etc. I mean, I think a number of those companies are sourcing from some of the more high-risk areas. Also, some of the footwear companies just have been sort of under pressure and on the radar of civil society for much longer. So I think something that we actually quite often see, that it's often those companies where there have been either controversies in the media, at least for that subsector, where then we see particularly good practices. Whereas luxury brands, for example, have been falling a bit under the radar, and a lot of them also, a number of them, for example, also pointed out that they manufacture in Italy where the risks are lower, which is true, but still we have actually seen in recent years a number of reports of Chinese migrant workers in factories in Italy and Spain also being exploited, and obviously there's also the risk from leather and cotton commodity sourcing. So I do think we will also see more development from those companies over time.
Great, thank you for that. And thanks to the audience members for sending in those questions. Please keep them coming. We are going to move on to Bennett Freeman now. He's a senior advisor to KnowTheChain. Bennett's got a history of being an innovative thinker in the human rights. As a U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under the Clinton administration, he led the State Department's development of voluntary principles on security and human rights. And more recently, he was Senior Vice President of Sustainability Research and Policy at Calvert Investments. Bennett, over to you.
Jackie, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to join you and my close colleague and friend Felicitas Weber, with whom I've been working closely on KnowTheChain now for over a year, and to join others of you on this call, many of whom no doubt I know and have worked with over the years in my Calvert capacity and others. I'd like, having just listened to Felicitas's very specific substantive presentation of KnowTheChain, and having heard a couple of your very good questions, and put this initiative in a broader context of why I think it matters overall, but why it matters in particular and how it can be used by investors. And I'll just take a few minutes to make those points, and then I'm happy to take any questions along with Felicitas and others as we wrap up the call here. The first broad observation that I'd like to make is that in my experience as one who's been in the business and human rights world for over 15 years, in the responsible investment world the last 10 years, that the whole nexus of forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking issues have come to prominence really like almost no other set of issues in the whole business and human rights world. These are not new problems, but they have gained a much sharper focus, I think it's fair to say, over the last half dozen years as a whole range of companies and activists and investors and governments and international institutions have become much more aware of what I call the kind of hydra-headed beast, if you will, of forced labor and trafficking in modern slavery. It manifests itself in so many forms in so many industries around the world. So this set of issues has really come to the fore for those of us who work on business and human rights, those of us who work in the responsible investment world. It's not coincidental that the last 2 years in a row that the SRI conference has featured panel sessions on different aspects of human trafficking and modern slavery, nor is it coincidental that IEN decided to focus on this topic given the growing interest on the part of responsible investors as well as foundations and endowments. The second broad contextual point I'd like to make is about KnowTheChain and where it fits in the broader category, if you will, of other benchmarking and ranking initiatives. What's really been remarkable to observe, and in my case to participate in and contribute to, has been the emergence the last 4 or 5 years of different benchmarking and ranking initiatives which look at particular issues and particular practices by particular companies and industries and give a whole range of stakeholders and investors a set of criteria on which to assess companies' commitment and performance. And there's a whole set of these that have emerged. There's access to medicines that look at pharma companies in particular. There's Oxfam's behind the brands that have evaluated food, beverage, and agriculture companies on a whole range of labor issues, poverty and development, climate and environmental sustainability. There's Ranking Digital Rights that looks at tech companies, internet, mobile communications, and telco companies, commitment and performance around internet censorship and surveillance. There's also the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Initiative, which I'm among the founders of and members of the steering committee, that is going to be benchmarking and ranking companies in an initial set of 3 sectors coming in 2 months from now in mid-March, but with many other sectors and companies to follow over the next several years across the whole range of human rights issues and risks. What I'm observing in my work with the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Initiative, with KnowTheChain, also my involvement with Ranking Digital Rights and with Behind the Brands, all of them, except for access to medicines, is what I call the catalytic impact that these benchmarking and ranking initiatives are already having on companies. Sometimes we can see companies make and disclose new, stronger, more sharply defined policy commitments around certain issues. Sometimes we see disclosure of those commitments that had already been established but had not been communicated. Sometimes we even see what I call a race to the top between companies in the same sector who have been prodded by these benchmarking initiatives and then compete to see who can reach higher standards. I observed the catalytic impact that Oxfam's Behind the Brands had in triggering such a race to the top between PepsiCo and Coca-Cola around land rights and policy a couple of years ago. So I'm optimistic, in fact confident, that KnowTheChain can have a similar catalytic effect on the whole nexus of forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking issues. I'd like to just conclude by making the final pair of observations about what I think, in the very fundamental way, are the best ways for investors to use the KnowTheChain criteria and findings. And this was implicit in Felicitas' presentation, but I want to make it as explicit as possible, with the hope that many of those on the call will use KnowTheChain in these two ways. First, we really hope that a range of investors, whether they're portfolio managers or ESG researchers or analysts or buy-side or sell-side analysts, look at the criteria that have been developed generically across sectors, but sector by sector in each of these sector reports, and look at the findings and use these criteria and findings as you undertake your research and due diligence on companies that you hold or may hold in your portfolios. We want KnowTheChain to have a direct influence on how investors decide to allocate their capital across their portfolios. We've seen a tendency in this direction with those other benchmarking and ranking initiatives that have come out thus far, and we're beginning to see it in small examples. We hope to see more with KnowTheChain. So we really want investors and those involved in the investment research and decision-making process to, whether from a company valuation perspective or just an ESG research perspective, to use these criteria and findings wherever you can, beginning with these three sectors that have been the focus of the reports thus far. The second way that we really hope that KnowTheChain can be useful, that Felicitas also mentioned, and I just want to reinforce it, is to use it as a platform for engagement with companies. Dialogue with senior management, executives, C-suite executives, even boards of companies, to get companies to strengthen and sharpen their commitments, to expand their disclosure, and improve their commitment and performance around these really sensitive issues, and also as a basis for shareholder resolutions. And we're agnostic about how investors might proceed, whether some like to file resolutions initially to get the attention of companies. Others like to proceed by requesting and engaging in dialogue and holding resolutions off until they see whether dialogue makes progress. But whatever tactic one uses, we really hope that asset owners and asset managers will use these criteria, these findings on specific companies, to engage those companies with the objective of shoring up areas of weakness, solidifying areas of progress, spurring on movement toward leadership on a set of issues that are only going to become more complex, more sensitive, more relevant to company reputations and operations year by year, industry by industry, region of the world by region of the world. So that's how I see it for what it's worth, where KnowTheChain can be helpful and where it fits in this broader universe, if you will, of rankings and benchmark initiatives as the whole set of issues around forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking becomes increasingly important to so many of us. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bennett. That was great. So we've had a number of audience questions come from one of the points that Bennett made Felicitas, how did companies respond to their scores when they saw them? And then additionally, we had another question on the scores, which was how much of each company's score was based on their policy, and how much was based on what was actually observed. And the audience member goes on to give an example of Primark and H&M having impressive and comprehensive policies, but there are also being reports that these companies don't always pay a living wage and aren't always responding to striking workers well.
Thank you. Very interesting questions to hear. We had actually really good engagement with the companies, and the vast majority has responded very positive. I think for a number of them, it really helps them to drive the issue up internally and give it more oomph within the organization and get it to higher levels within the organization. Even like some of the lower scoring companies said it was very, very helpful as sort of a gap analysis for them to use. It was very positive as well, though, that even one of the very highest companies just said they don't want to be seen as, below a certain other company. So therefore, even, that it even drives this change among the higher leading companies, and really what Bennett alluded to, this sort of race to the top model, really very much seems to work. Interestingly, we also had a number of companies that approached us to see if they could use our methodology for self-assessment, and I also talked to one company who was actually very sad when they heard they weren't being benchmarked, because yeah, she was sort of, that person was very much hoping that they would be included. And again, I assume sort of the benefit I've mostly heard is yeah, that companies like it as sort of a gap analysis, and also to bring more attention internally. Yeah, there was 2 instances of very low scoring companies that weren't very happy with it, but in the dialogue I really got the impression that they don't actually understand the risks they face. And generally their sustainability disclosure was so limited. In a way, also I thought it was positive, though, to also get a negative response, because that means it got attention within the company, and it is seen, and they don't want to be seen as sort of a low scoring company. So I think that's a very positive tension actually to have. To the second part of that question, which was about policy versus performance. So we did look at public disclosure of companies, meaning we didn't verify on the ground to what extent those policies were implemented. And part of that is that really there is still such a lack of supply chain transparency that we really want to push for transparency within that. At the same time, we've tried to frame a number of indicators in a way that indicate whether a policy or a process is actually implemented. So is the company able to give a concrete example? Is the company able to, disclose the risks they identify, disclose how they have reacted in specific cases where they found recruitment fees, how have where workers' rights have been violated. And I think here, though, really important is we do want to get further down to that issue. And I think the corporate human rights benchmark, for example, is very interestingly is looking how companies respond to specific incidents. So that's something we want to evaluate and see if we can take that in. We also want to do a few trials next year where we look at how companies respond to risks related to a very specific country and a very specific commodity. I think with companies like Primark and H&M, I think it's just never quite black and white. It's often the biggest companies that have very large impacts on supply chain workers and might be doing good things in one country, or might have a fantastic water policy but not doing so well on another element. I think there is always the tension, but as I mentioned before, I think quite often it's also, in particular, Primark, I'm fairly sure they implemented that program because there have been those incidents of forced labor of young women in India, and that was sort of a driver for them to actually implement this very interesting program that I mentioned before.
Thanks for that. And an audience member had a question, building on the concept of KnowTheChain as a platform for engaging companies. They wanted to know if there's information on the website about joining engagement efforts already underway regarding a company's supply chain practices.
So is that about joining engagements undertaken by other investors? Is that right?
I would assume that it's by other, yeah, I would assume that it's by other investors, or is this, why don't we expand it to, are there ways for investors to join any engagements that you guys already have going on?
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, we don't at the moment. The Interface Center for Corporate Responsibility in the US is doing some really great work specifically on the recruitment fee element, and in fact has a workshop with a number of the really big players today. So that is something to consider. The PRI is doing a broader engagement on supply chain labor standards in agriculture, but I think it's a very good point, so we'll make sure to put any information there, and also if we from KnowTheChain organize anything specific. You are certainly welcome to contact me. There's a couple of investors who just contacted me individually about engaging certain companies, so I may be able to put you in touch.
Great. And for both of you, how do we make sure that the investment industry really understands that doing well on these issues, scoring well on benchmarks like this, is tied to investment performance and to fiduciary duty in the long run?
Well, this is Bennett Freeman. That's a very good question. And our view is that issues around forced labor, modern slavery, are at least salient to investors and may be material in certain industry circumstances. Nobody has yet really done work to demonstrate quantifiable materiality, but we do think that the issues at least are salient insofar as they really give investors confidence or not as to whether companies are handling reputational risks, supply chain management risks, risks that could lead to, if mishandled, that could lead to litigation, to very onerous regulations, that could lead to even to limiting market participation in certain parts of the world. So from that standpoint, there may be some materiality here. There's other efforts underway, partly under the aegis of UNPRI, to explore this whole proposition around human rights, labor rights, and financial and investment materiality. In fact, Felicitas and I have helped get that process underway over the last year or so. But our view is that investors do care about these issues, and I'm seeing in my own work in engagement with investors very heavily in the UK and Europe, as well as in North America, that it's not just the so-called SRIs and the faith-based investors who've been focused on these issues for years, but there's a growing number now of asset owners and asset managers who are keenly aware of the issues and are prime audience now for the KnowTheChain initiative. So I think there may be some materiality down the road, but we're certain that at least there's salience at the as more and more investors are made aware of these problems and risks.
And just to add to that, so I think is a very good point that there is efforts underway, but really the systematic analysis, we don't have that yet. But I think there is some very good sort of individual cases that really demonstrate how much it can affect portfolio value. So there was in 2015 there was a U.S. Marine Services company that went bankrupt after they had to pay $20 million in compensation to victims of forced labor, and there was two pension funds very heavily invested in that company that lost about $70 million. There's increasingly cases coming where companies have to pay compensation, and last year there was a case of a Thai tuna company that had to pay over $1 million of compensation, and and just late last year, also a UK chicken company agreed to 1 million compensation. So I think there's this very, very good individual cases. And I think it was also very positive to see. We did an event in London a couple of months ago, and we really had a very different audience to what I've seen in the past on human rights issues. And I think that's very much also driven by the fact that there is increasing investigative journalism on those issues, but also there's really increasing legislation, and the UK Modern Slavery Act, for example, also applies to a number of global companies, and it seems like that's sort of a growing trend also within other countries. So I am hopeful that we can make this case, and maybe already have to some extent.
We've discussed quite a bit how investors can use engagement to address these issues. Do you have any advice or opinion on any other strategies? Should they be using other strategies to address portfolio risk related to forced labor risk?
I think Bennett made a very good point that it's not only about engagement, but also about ESG integration. I think there's also a number of other things investors can do, and I'm sure Bennett can chime in here as well, is, for example, engaging with policymakers, like a number of investors have done as well. Also, maybe developing a strong investment policies, developing clear expectations for external investment managers and service providers that have strong human rights provisions, I think, are other things that investors could do. And maybe Bennett, do you have
No, that's good.
Yeah.
So the policy piece is very important, and so we have, as most of you know, there are two major pieces of legislation that have been enacted over the last half dozen years, similar to each other, both requiring that companies operating in their jurisdictions disclosed due diligence efforts to address the whole nexus of issues we're talking about here. The first is the California Supply Chain Transparency Act. The second is the UK Modern Slavery Act. It's important to know that there's been active investor engagement in both. I was very happy on my watch at Calvert Investments that Calvert, together with Christian Brothers and the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, ICCR, prepared and published an investor's guide to the California Supply Chain Transparency Act in 2011. I'm also very pleased that so many UK-based investors have been actively engaged in supporting the UK Modern Slavery Act. Rathbones is probably foremost among those UK asset managers that's played a key role there. Share Action, the London-based shareholder advocacy umbrella group, has also played a leading role in the last year or so. So we're seeing a keen interest now on the part of UK investors as they're looking at and examining company disclosures as required by the UK Modern Slavery Act. We're hoping to spur similar investor engagement in what we hope will be comparable reporting requirements in the EU, and at some point in the US as well. It's hard to predict much of anything politically or legislatively in the US, given our change of government taking place in about 24 hours here tomorrow. But it is notable that a legislation was introduced in the previous Congress similar to the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, similar also to Dodd-Frank 1502 on conflict minerals, that would require companies based in the U.S. or registered in U.S. stock exchanges to disclose their due diligence efforts. That legislation envisioned a SEC disclosure mechanism. I don't think that that's politically viable in the short term, but I'm hopeful, I wouldn't say optimistic, but hopeful that this new incoming Congress and administration on a bipartisan basis might enact some kind of disclosure requirement, if not through the SEC, then maybe through the Department of Labor. And I'm confident that if such legislation moves forward on a bipartisan basis, that we'll see investor support for it.
Well, we've run out of time now, guys, unfortunately, but I wanted to thank you both so much. It's always so fantastic to talk to you, and this is a lot of great information, I'm sure, for our attendees to mull over. Thank you all who've attended. We really appreciate it, and we will be sending follow-up material around in an email. Always, as Felicitas mentioned, please feel free to reach out to her with any questions you have, and always please feel free to reach out to the Intentional Endowments Network and let us know how we can further help educate you in this area. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.